Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. I'm very excited today to have special guest John Seel. John has a doctorate in American Studies from the University of Maryland, an MDiv from Covenant Theological Seminary, and a BA from Austin College. He also previously worked with James Davison Hunter, a name many of you might know, at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, and helped start a lot of institutions whose names you might know. But in the interest of actually getting into the meat of it, I won't go through them. But I'm like, wow, I'm curious about how you got into that. I almost want to do another podcast on some of those. John, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's a great honor.
The reason that I asked him to join the podcast is because he has a new white paper out called The Challenge of Cultural Engagement. It was actually commissioned by my friend Dwight Gibson for his consultancy, The Exploration Group. And I thought it was a really fine exploration of some of the challenges that we face as a church in the modern age and some ideas about how to respond to it. And in fact, John, as I was reading through it, I'm thinking, I feel like you plagiarized my new book that's coming out because
No,
you came to the same ideas a lot of them did, which is great validation.
no,
I think that some of the similar themes that I had. So I'm glad I'm not feeling totally off base on it. I want to start by reading a excerpt from your paper and get your reaction to it.
okay.
You say there is a widespread feeling of dis-ease among Americans today. This feeling is compounded among people of faith. Many sense that they are living in a world no longer compatible with their core convictions, even more, a world that is a direct assault on common sense. From family life to public life, everything feels upside down. This dis-ease is well-founded and is reflective of real changes in society. There's been a shift in the plate tectonics of American religious culture in the past 20 years. Incremental changes have now accumulated to the point that people are consciously aware of a social and cultural paradigm shift. We are living in a different world from the past. The ubiquitous nature of social media, the internet, and the pandemic have only served to accelerate the implications of these changes. I think you nail it that this is how people are thinking. Tell us how you analyze this world. What is the framework that you use to help make sense of what has happened, whether in the last 20 years or the last 200 years?
Well, I think we have to look at it. I'm principally a cultural person. And I think that if you overplay the political, you end up skating on the surface and not looking at the deeper causative factors. But I think that there are deep cultural factors at play that make this not only a unique shift, but historically unprecedented shift. Now, I'm enough of an academic to know that if you say something is historically unprecedented, you have shifted from academics to journalism. Because we would actually never really know within the academy whether or not something is fundamentally a big cultural shift, what I would call like a Augustinian shift with the collapse of Rome, that level of a shift for 150 years, maybe 200 years. But in general, people have a deep sense that something fundamentally has changed. And the way paradigm shifts happen is you have a lot of small accumulated things happen. And then finally, people realize, we are just in a completely different world. Now, you've identified this under a broad category as being in the negative world. And generally, my sense of it parallels that analysis, but I would take it deeper. All I would simply say is the negative world is how we feel and how we're treated. But the fact is, beneath that is something real is actually changed so that, in fact, the reason you feel the way you feel is totally legitimate because actually reality has shifted. There is a new paradigm at play. And more and more people are beginning to feel like this is really a different world we're in, and we're going to have to think things through in a different way, missionally within the church. Now, there are within the church temptations, I would say, to take an easy way out. One is to demonize the shift and to simply say, well, obviously, all of America has been overtaken by Jezebelian demons. Or we could say, yes, we're at the cusp of revival, which is also a way of kind of hitting the super spiritual easy button. Or thanks to the new conflict in the Middle East, the tendency would be immediately to go to a prophetic lens. Now, all of those things may actually be a factor, but that doesn't actually change the reality of how we have to navigate and move forward as a church. And my assumption is we have to really rethink the world we're in, and we have to develop biblically grounded, missionally innovative approaches to the future. And I'm, as you know, not one for retreat. I am not one for head for the hills. I am one for aggressively engaging culture. That being said, your critique of people who are cultural engagers is not lost on me at all. And I actually think that we have to be more aware of the situation we're in and less naive to the fact that we're not simply moving against the current of culture, but the whole dynamic of culture has shifted to a pattern in which the church may have never faced this situation quite before. And that, from my standpoint, makes this one of the most exciting times ever to be alive. I mean, I would say my only regret is that I'm so old.
Yes.
My only regret is that I'm not going to be able to see the fruit of the challenges that the church faces, because I'm giving everything I have for the remaining years of my life to help equip the next generation to meet what I think is going to be a pivotal moment in the history of the church.
One of the points you make is that the old strategies are not going to work. I want to read another little quote here. You say, acknowledging the scope and character of this change means that we can no longer simply rely on historical precedents. There is no going back, only forward. We cannot appeal to the strategies of the early church or to the Reformation era, as these approaches will be fundamentally inadequate to the challenges facing faith today under the unique conditions of advanced spiritual modernity. And I'll make two comments, and I would like to get your reaction. The first comment I have is, as you've probably seen in my work, I really think so much of the thinking people do, especially in the conservative world, is rooted in pre-modern paradigms. People want to go back to the Greco-Roman classics, or they want to look at the great books, or they want to look at the American founding. They want to look at a lot of things and do not take account of the peculiar and unique conditions of modernity, as I call them. Mass media and modern communications technologies just being one example of them, which you highlight in it. And so the models that were created in completely different eras may only be partially at best applicable in this one. The second is, in my observation, is that the various evangelical groups have essentially been doubling down on their existing strategies. You know, what I label the culture war people have essentially taken the position is the problem with Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson said they didn't fight hard enough. This time we're going to fight harder and we're going to win. Although that's the exact same thing those guys said back in the day. And then what I labeled the cultural engagement people, which we'll circle back at this because you might mean something different by it than I do. In the urban kind of church model, if you might think of it, they're sort of, I think, doubling down on the same status quo, maybe even a little more syncretistic with the culture on some of these issues, like the way that they really dived headfirst into BLM, for example. If we don't want to just try to repeat an old script, how should we be thinking about producing something new?
Well,
and you can disagree with the things I just said too, by the way.
I don't disagree. Well, I do think there's a much that we can gain from the pre-moderns. So let me start there. Your point is well taken. A naive application of pre-modern institutional structures in the midst of advanced modernity is ludicrous. That being said, to develop a more pre-modern notion of enchantment, the nature of reality, and a deeper, fuller-orbed understanding of the supernaturalism which was characteristic of that ethos, that is, I think, both salient, and I also am a strong advocate of classical education. So from the standpoint of being transformative of people, I'm a very strong supporter of that perspective. But
I should add that one of those institutions I did not mention is that you were the founding headmaster of a classical Christian school at one point.
True. That being said, is to think that you can apply those institutional structures to an advanced modernity world is very naive. The fact of the matter is, we're going to have to develop completely new institutional structures, new ways forward. And my general approach would be four things. One, whatever the challenge that we're facing, we need to start by humanizing it. That is, we need to see it not as a public policy problem, but as a human problem, perhaps even a pastoral problem. That is, I would strongly urge that we see people as people through the eyes of Jesus. And secondly, I would argue that we need to engage the problem, not run away from it, and not think in tribal terms, but actually try to live into the brokenness that we're facing. Third, I would argue that we need to elevate the conversation. By elevate, I mean go upstream, go to the source of the problems as much as possible. In other words, my general model is that if politics is here, culture is upstream from politics, and religion and faith is upstream from culture. And so if you're simply fighting on a public policy basis on the level of politics, you're not elevating the conversation to the deeper level. And if you're fighting a cultural problem and the problem is really one of idolatry, you're not really, when you should be talking about matters of faith and idolatry, you're not elevating the problem. So I always urge us to elevate the conversation to get to the sources of the problem and not just deal with symptoms. And then, of course, we have to reframe the issue. I'm a very strong advocate of reframing, namely that whoever owns the frame of the conversation owns the conversation. And many times we simply throw facts at a problem without reframing the problem at the deeper level. And if the facts don't fit the frame, the facts bounce off and the frame stays. So if you're going to win a debate, you've got to actually change the frame. And the frames are not changed normally. A person's frame is not changed normally by argumentation and reason. It's changed by engaging their imagination so that they have an aha experience and see the world through new eyes, new lenses, a new way of thinking about things. Now, we're not very good about doing any of that. But the fact of the matter is, we assume way too much that everybody's operating in our frame. Now, that's not the case on any issue today. From the music you download to the beer you drink, it's a framing issue. Somebody is going to be strongly disagreeing with you. And so we've got to learn to reframe the issues in a deep way. For example, let me just give you an illustration. All discussions of sexuality in America depend on two completely separate frames. If you just delve into the problem of sexuality without challenging the frames, you're just going to be miscommunicating. And I grew up in Asia and South Korea, and the Korean term for this is East question, West answer. You'll just be going right past each other. And the fact is that those two frames are sexuality actually means something and is actually rooted in cosmology and has some sacred meaning in the nature of reality. Or it's simply a matter of consent between two adults in a form of intimate exercise. Now, those are completely different frames. And you have to actually win the frame. That is, now, not everybody who thinks that sexuality is sacred necessarily is a Christian. There are people who would argue for natural law, for a whole sets of reasons besides just being the Bible says so. But the fact is, does sexuality have something to do with the cosmos? Is it cosmologically grounded? Is it rooted in the nature of reality? Or is it simply a choice between two adults? Well, that's a very big difference of opinion, and we have to make a distinction between those, and we have to win the frame before we can delve into the problems. Likewise, I would say on the trans issue, it's very tempting to dive into women's in sports and bathrooms and pronouns and 1,001 expressions of a deeper problem, which is a framing problem. And the framing problem is one that goes back to on what is the basis of our identity. And if you have the frame that your identity is designed by yourself, well, then we're talking a completely different language. And until I can help people say that that's actually not the way the world works, and in fact, our identity is derived by a relationship, an ongoing relationship with Jesus and who he says we are as his children, and it's not something I create, well, we're talking two completely different frames. So my point is to elevate, reframe, and the last thing I would do is ground in biblical truth, ground in objective reality. Now, I'm someone who still believes there is such a thing as objective reality and believes that there is such a thing as nature, and I think nature tells us about the nature of reality. And one of the things nature teaches us is that the assumptions of expressive individualism, which is the thinking behind this I design myself, is fundamentally wrong. All nature says is that all reality is dependent, radically so, on something other and larger than itself. And all the first move of reality is always up and out. You put a plant on a windowsill and it will move to the sun. And so all of reality depends on sunlight. No, nothing in reality, nothing in nature says, I am self-sufficient. I define myself. I am my own autonomous creation. No, that's not true. All of reality says something different to that. Now, the Bible says the same thing, but the fact is we can either go to reality, to nature, or we can go to the Bible. But the fact is we need to ground our frame. At the end of the day, we need to basically make a point of grounding it in something that is fixed, true, and objective.
You could apply the things you just said to a number of domains. You could
Yes.
apply them to sort of strengthening the body of believers.
Uh-huh.
You could apply them to that task. You could apply them to the task of evangelization, or you could apply them to the task of trying to change broader culture.
That's right.
Which of those did you have in mind? Or if it's all of them, like where do you have the emphasis?
I think we will get to the question of broader culture. In other words, like if you're interested in cultural change, this overly inflated, hyperbolic notion, the world by 2050, or is based on no sense of history and very poor social science. These are generational, 100-year projects. And so now I'm all in favor of it. I'm an activist in the sense that I'm passionate about changing culture. And the reason I'm not a professional academic is because I would rather do something about it rather than talk about it. But that being said, I have a pastoral passion for people who are spiritual but not religious, or religious nuns, NONES, or spiritually disaffiliated, or people who are deconstructing. And over half of our young people are leaving the church in droves, fit into that category. And those are my people. Those are the ones I write for, write to, care about, listen to, and try to understand and identify with. Now, that being said, I'm not actually taken very seriously as a thought person within that community because I do not have a very defined deconstructive narrative. In other words, I have not lost my faith and struggle, have a big crisis of faith, etc. I am simply somebody who cares deeply about this world, was heavily influenced by Schaeffer and others as I was growing up. And now I see the mess that my generation has made to the next generation. And frankly, everything we did in the last 50 years is not working. It's not going to work in the future. And so now is the time to recognize we have an opportunity to do something different. And if we can do something different, we can reach a new generation that, for very good reasons, needs to do some deconstructing. In other words, some deconstructing of traditional churches warranted, and you're not really paying attention if you're not. And but that being said, we need to reconstruct on a new model based on the traditions of the church and biblical truth and the nature of reality in a way that is faithful to the past as we move forward to the future. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it shows me kind of where you're aiming with
So,
these things.
so I think if we don't speak missionally about real people and simply leave the conversation in the clouds about changing the universe, we're not going to get to the kind of concrete specifics that we need if we're going to actually do effective cultural change, which will be generational in its scope. So part of it's pragmatic. You're not going to understand how to do the big if you don't do the small. And the fact is, we need to be able to do the concrete before we're able to do the general.
I agree. It's so much easier to talk about fixing big macro scale problems than it is affecting one human life for the better.
That's right.
That's like a very difficult problem. It's easier to talk about the Middle East peace process or something like that.
Yeah, I mean,
Easy to have opinions on that.
it'd be much easier for pastors to say, well, let me start with my own children.
Yeah.
And that because a vast majority of pastors' kids are leaving the church or worse.
Hmm.
And the fact of the matter is, we do well to start there and then move forward before we are, giving out big pronouncements on how we're going to see all of the changes in the Middle East clearly through the lens of Revelation. I think this is a project doomed for failure and ripe for hubris.
One of the things that you say is the need for exploration, which obviously is one of the reasons that Dwight asked you about this. I've been very struck for many years by his concept of exploration and exploration thinking, which, if there were one paradigm I would like to maybe see grow in the world, is this paradigm, how to think this way. You could even think of it as Silicon Valley startup language, but just in a different way. And you say this about the future. The spiritual attitudes that we need are humility, dependence, and exploration. We don't know fully what we should do, and this is okay. We will make mistakes, and this is also okay. In the spirit of entrepreneurship, we will need to fail fast while maintaining self-awareness of our motives, actions, and consequences. We will need to be patient. We are embarking on a long-term exploration, a lifetime spiritual adventure. And I agree completely on this. And this is one of the things that I also put in my book, in part because I wanted to showcase this exploration and thinking that is so important. Is this isn't like Bill Hybels back in the 70s, going door to door, surveying people on why they didn't go into church, like classic market research. Right. Now I'm going to design the product that we know is going to appeal to the people. Classic business approach. We're in a more fundamentally uncertain and unknown environment, and nobody's going to be able to tell you, hey, here's the A, B, C, 1, 2, 3 to how we're going to address this thing, because we don't know, and we're in a very dynamic situation.
In fact, if people do say they know, it's a clue that they don't.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, you have to start with a kind of radical dependence on the Holy Spirit. And the problem we have is that we get defensive and we go to our corners and we double down on what we know to be true. And then we close our fist and we hold on to those certainties with a tenaciousness that is primarily cognitive. And then we become basically jerks for Jesus and Pharisees in our hearts. And so the fact is, we have to stay true and faithful to biblical principles, and yet at the same time recognize attitudinally, I could be wrong. Reality is more complicated than I can possibly understand. And that particularly includes my understanding of God. And certainly the circumstances of the complexity of living in a global, interconnected, multidimensional, multivariant world. And third, I do not have a corner on the truth, and there's probably something meaningful that I can learn from you. Now, all we have to do is adopt a different posture and say, let's explore reality together. It means that it's not that I don't have convictions. It does not mean I'm going woke. It does not mean I'm going liberal. It simply means I am recognizing the humanness of my own humanness. I mean, I'm operating with, in academic terms, epistemic humility. And I just think the Bible calls us to that. And for me, I mean, one of the great freedoms I have, I write a lot. My wife says I never have an unpublished thought, and that's certainly true of you. But that being said, I write a lot, but I don't have to be right. Huh? Now, when I write and you push back, as you do often, and others do, I try to listen, and often I will push back as well. In other words, we have a real meaningful dialogue. It's not like I'm a pushover,
Mm-hmm.
or I think that I'm. In other words, you criticized me one time as being basically in the winsome camp, and when you use the winsome camp, that is not a positive term for you. It basically means you are a borderline compromising wimp in culture. At least that's how I hear it. So that being said, I will push back on that and say, well, okay, it's true. I'm not big on being a jerk for Jesus, but I also want to recognize there is a temptation of accommodating to the interviewers at the New York Times with whom you are being interviewed. That is very real. And if we don't acknowledge the temptation and the places where we shade, and rather than say this is a hard line, then we're not quite aware of the nature of the hostility of the world we're in. And so I'm saying, look, I've got to take all of your critique pretty seriously, because it's aimed directly at people like me. In other words, you're basically saying, yeah, you were doing well in a neutral world, but welcome to the party. We're not in a neutral world. We're in a negative world, and you are playing the game by neutral world principles, and we are not in that world anymore. And I'm going to say, you're right. And I actually am going to say it's worse than you think. In other words, in my paper, I argue that it's not just that we're in a negative world, we're in a death work culture, to use Philip Reef's term. Yeah. And that death work culture is historically unprecedented. The church has never faced this before, and we cannot assume the past to go forward to the future. We are in literally uncharted territory. Right. Now, we can either freak out about that, or we can say, we're not alone. Jesus is still with us. The Holy Spirit is still with us. Biblical truths are still true. They're true to the nature of reality. But what we've been doing, is not working. Clearly is not working. I mean, 75%, actually it's a little more than that, 78% of people who are leaving, who are now religious nuns, who are religiously disaffiliated, came from the church. The biggest source of the retreat from Christianity is Christianity. Now, if you were a business person and you were the source of your own undermine, your own failure, you would think, well, maybe we should stop digging this hole. And the fact is, what we do is we just dig harder and faster. And I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work.
I want to hit a couple areas of where you talked about the potential solutions. One of which I found very intriguing, and you alluded to it earlier, is your argument that modernity is over dependent on left brain, rationalistic, analytical type thinking, and that we need to recover more right brain thinking. Hopefully, that's the right hemispheres. I never get that right.
You're
And
right.
more imagination, etc. You know, Rod Dreher, his new book that he's working on is about re-enchanting the world. And Rod is very good at putting his finger on emerging trends. And just like liturgy became a trend several years ago, people started looking for more than some of these traditional services. I believe re-enchantment is really going to be one of the big themes of the future. And so you're hitting it.
I could not agree more.
What what is sort of the things that are driving you to that conclusion? I'm curious.
Well, it's primarily the work of, well, I mean, first of all, life experience. In other words, and to put in simple terms, I would say acute failure in your life has basically knocked off my overconfidence in left brain focus. Now, first of all, I will say very candidly, I'm a very serious left brain Germanic Enlightenment reformed oriented person. Having lived a life long enough that a lot of that has been fundamentally challenged. And if you know me well enough, the real foil, that is what I'm most sensitive to and fighting against through coded terms all around the place, is I am anti-enlightenment. And I think that the Enlightenment and the church's accommodation to enlightenment is part of our own undoing, and it's what has disenchanted the church. And then, of course, I was reinforced, that is, my bias and life experience was reinforced by the work of Ian McGilchrist, the British neuroscientist who's written massive works on the fact that our brain actually works in a different way than the way the West has biased it, and that the West's accommodation to the left brain is a source of its own undoing, and that the world probably cannot sustain itself because this is not the way it was meant to work, and it's not the way the brain works. And so the fact is we've got to recapture a deeper appreciation of the right brain's relationship to the left brain and the role imagination has with reason. Now, that's not to say that it's one or the other. It's always both and. In fact, almost either or thinking is by its very nature left brain. Yin and yang, the overlapping either or, that's right brain way of thinking. The point being is that we need to recapture an appreciation of the imagination, a deeper sense of poetry, a deeper sense of myth. And Lewis, of course, is a champion of this because he was so far ahead of his time, because he recognized that reason was the organ of truth, but imagination was the organ of meaning. And something actually has to mean something to somebody before it can be true or false to somebody.
Mm.
So the fact of the matter is, in typical Enlightenment form, we've let the cart lead the horse here, and we're now hammering people with truth when they don't have any meaning and it's not meaningful to them. and we are not engaging their imaginations in any meaningful way. And just from the standpoint of rhetoric, even classical rhetoric, this is not the way you persuade people. And so I have talked about earlier about frames. If you have frame A and frame B, reason works well within a frame. Reason has no traction between frames. The only way you get people to move from frame to frame, from one frame to another, is through engaging their imagination.
So you're talking like Thomas Kuhn here,
Yes.
the structure of scientific revolutions.
Yes. And the fact is, and of course, Kuhn, what was the term he used for paradigm shift?
Paradigm
Conversion.
shift.
Yeah, paradigm shift was a form of intellectual conversion.
Yes.
And so the fact is that we need to recognize that now, thankfully, there's a growing number of people within the apologetic world who are recognizing that we need to engage the imagination as a central component of this larger conversation. In other words, there's a place for bringing reason into the equation, but we need to begin by engaging the imagination. And so there are any number of scholars at Houston Baptist University and their Department of Apologetics there that are leading the conversation in this regard. Now, many of them, not surprisingly, are Catholic or Anglican and not Bible church evangelicals, who are much more inclined to be on the Enlightenment reason side. Now, the person who was the most critical of the churches baptizing the perspective of the Enlightenment was Leslie Newbigin. He was a missiologist. He was a missionary in Africa for many years, came back to England and was like, whoa, wait a minute, guys.
You know, when you talk about this, it makes me think of someone like Isaac Newton, who was both an incredible scientist and mathematician, but also a great mystic.
Yes.
In a lot of ways. And, you know,
or Aquinas at the end of his life was a mystic. Now, that mystical turn is a spiritual turn toward enchantment. And so I'm a big one for learning from. Now, what tradition used the word enchantment the most and was most cognizant of having to deal with really seriously oriented pagans? The Celtic tradition. Well, there's a lot that we can learn from Patrick and Bridget and others in the Celtic tradition about how we move forward and navigate. See, the problem we have within the church is that we tend to like our atheist interlocutors to be tweed wearing, pipe smoking, microevolutionary biologists at a university. Then we know how to deal with them. You know, the Hickens, the Dawkins, etc. What we don't know how to deal with is an ex-evangelical trans Wiccan witch. And what Lewis is going to argue is the ex-evangelical trans Wiccan witch is actually a lot closer to the gospel than this atheist guy. Now, the problem we have is we have absolutely no idea how to deal with this blessed person that is so angry, so confused, and so wounded by the church that we don't have any idea what to do about bringing that person forward to the gospel. In other words, we don't know how to move people from myths to myths that are true, or from Joseph Campbell to Jesus Christ, or we don't know how to move them from a confused spiritualism to a deep spiritual mysticism rooted in the gospel.
Mm.
We don't know how to do that very well.
Another thing that you talk a lot about in this paper, and it's something I believe you've written an entire book on, is the importance of networks. What will be the role of networks in the future?
Well, the backstory of networks is that it's a critique of Enlightenment understanding of individualism. I mean, so again, the backstory of my interest in networks is the fact that it counters the notion that one person who's a genius, who's a celebrity, can change the world. That's not actually the way the world works. That's not the way history has worked. That's not the way nature works. Nature works in a collaborative, networked fashion. And the fact is that if we can get past ourselves and start working in a collaborative way and operate within genuine networks that have a shared cause concept, we can make a fundamental difference within the world, because that's actually all of social science. There's a whole science behind network science. And all I've tried to do is make it more explicit in my book, Network Power, because that's actually the way things get done. If you're interested in changing culture, it's going to be done through the creation of dense networks with a certain kind of humble leader who is willing to defer to the generative dynamic of the network. And there's almost no one being trained in leadership within seminaries with that understanding of leadership, such that, in fact, now, this goes back to your point on servant leadership, which I totally agree with. What we don't mean by servant leadership is wimp leadership. We want missional, noble, cause-oriented leadership. But the fact of the matter is, there is an awareness that we need to return authority to the network, and that we're not the be all and end all, that it's actually collaborative forms of leadership. And almost all of our churches are operating on some basis of imperial leadership. And then all of our institutional structures, like publishing, film, all the Christian institutions, are based not on what you say, but the platform you hold. It's all about clicks and likes. And so basically, you can't get a book published today unless you have a significant pre-existing platform, which is simply a dynamic of celebrity culture commodified. And the fact that we can't quite see this, that this is a problem, is, I walked into a church in Colorado Springs, and there was a larger than life-size cardboard cutout of the pastor in the foyer.
Wow.
Well, I didn't need to know anything more about the dynamic of that church. Now, it wasn't long after that particular pastor was involved in a massive church scandal. But how do those kind of church scandals happen? Well, it's the sin of a lone individual. Yes, and we're loving to talk about that. But sociologically, what's the institutional structure that creates the circle of yes men and self-reflecting boards and family members that are part of the board? I mean, you don't get to Ravi Zacharias without having a fundamental institutional problem in the structure and nature of American evangelicalism itself.
It sounds like you're making the observation that I did, that rather than it not per se being a network, what I called a closed network, it's a set of closed networks. Unlike something like Silicon Valley, which are open networks, where people have more loose ties,
Right?
and it's not like you're part of this patron client hierarchy and things of that nature. Um, yeah, evangelicalism is kind of weird in that way. It is super hierarchical, and yeah, it's strange. I agree.
It operates with a closed fist, closed network, and hierarchical authoritarianism. And under pressure, its worst features are celebrated.
Hmm. I
And
want.
so the fact of the matter is, people wonder why in the world 81% of people are so excited, evangelicals are so excited about Trump. Because he's a mirror image of your core convictions. That's why.
Wow. I need to get a clip of that and post that on social media because that's going to be a good one.
I
I've
mean,
never heard that one before.
well, I mean,
It's a
basically,
great insight. I agree with it.
well, basically, there is a academic term called habitus, which means your inculcated dispositions that are framed from childhood about certain attitudes and myths of the world. And basically, American evangelicalism, people who've studied it are like, it's very odd because evangelicalism does not follow its theology, it doesn't follow its creeds, it operates in a completely different mode. Yeah, that's right. Now, Marston finally recognized, he says, yes, American evangelicalism follows its myths. And its myths are these deeply inculcated historical dispositions of we're a city on a hill, we're a populist, revivalist country, and the nation was stolen from us, and so then we retreated. Now we're reasserting ourselves, and now we're reevaluating ourselves. The fact is that 4 of the 5 dominant characteristics of the evangelical habitus are the things that Trump celebrated.
Hmm.
It was a glove that fit the hand attitudinally, not doctrinally, not in terms of personal lifestyle, but in terms of disposition toward life. Now, let me give you an example. I'm an MK. I grew up in Korea, and my parents were missionaries in Korea for 38 years. My father was a head and neck cancer surgeon, ran a 600 bed hospital, was with the Presbyterian Church. Basically was he was an evangelical that my father was an evangelical that was not interested in leaving the Southern Presbyterian Church because of race. So he would say he was an ecumenically minded, socially conservative, uh, evangelical. Now, and I grew up in that ethos. Now, I'm seminary trained and I have a PhD in culture. And the reason I have an interest in culture is because I'm a third culture kid. And as an adult, I've come to be aware of the fact that I have all the Korean biases toward the Japanese.
Hmm.
Now, intellectually, I know better. And it's also true that I never read books on Japanese are terrible people. I just grew up in Korea. That's all that happened. Now, I've talked about this at great length with Mako Fujimura, my good friend who's Japanese American. The fact is that I know better, but at the same time, I have to watch myself because inculcated in who I am are these hidden dispositions from my youth that at one level I know better, but at the same time, it's very easy for me to think of all Japanese as Nazis, just like that. Now, I know better, but that's the experience of Asians to this day in the ongoing tensions they have with Japanese and its history. Now, that just taught me something about myself and how these dispositions are hard to go away, and we need to be self-reflective enough to know. But the American church is deeply embedded in these kind of characteristics. Now, are these kind of characteristics easily changed? No. Who actually doesn't have these deeply ingrained evangelical negative habitus attitudes? Disconnected ex-evangelicals and people who live in the Pacific Northwest who never had a Bible Belt memory. Is there hope? Sure, there's hope. But it's probably not coming from people my age. Simply because it's a bridge too far. And you have to be kind of compassionate. I feel there's a lot of discussion, you probably talked about it, of pastors burning out. And lots of them are. And a lot of them pushing or opting out post-COVID. Well, part of it is their work pattern, and part of it is the structure of celebrity expectation. But the other fact is they are entering a world they cannot possibly understand. It's a new paradigm. And everything they've done their entire life is upside down. And they have, they can rack their brains and they can, but it is just impossible for them to get their minds around it.
I agree, particularly since I don't think any of us fully have our minds around it yet.
No.
And so if you're really set in a certain paradigm that you were marinated in, it's very, very difficult to do. I always say most people can't change at the end of the day. Even any personal change, very difficult. Think about just losing weight and keeping it off, for example. Changing these deep patterns that you can see the size of your belt every day when you put it on. Many of these things you can't even see. You're not even aware that you have them. How much harder is it then to change? All right. Well, John, we've been talking about an hour, so I think we'll bring it to an end because I could easily keep going a very long time because I actually have a lot more questions I could ask. But maybe we'll have to schedule a follow-up.
Let's do it again. I'd love interacting with you. It's these are important matters, and we need to be thinking about them carefully because, frankly, the church doesn't want to talk about them. And the other fact is that it's not safe in many churches to talk about them without creating a firestorm. And so what happens is podcasts are created, which are semi-neutral places for educated conversations that actually can't happen within educational institutions because of the rigidity of their structure. So what you're doing is enormously salient and important for the church because, frankly, um, these are critical matters. I mean, this is, this is Mordecai talking to Esther time.
Right.
This is for such a time as this, we've got to figure out that we need to adopt a biblically grounded, missionally innovative, engaged strategy for life change and cultural change. And we need to be enough self-critical of ourselves so that we can hopefully move forward with some measure of personal spirituality and integrity as we talk about these matters.
Again, John Seel is my guest. He's the author of a new white paper on the challenge of cultural engagement. A link to download it is in the show notes. John, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's a great honor.